Part 7. County Limerick, May 1847. The mornings no longer felt quite so cold. Mist still drifted across the fields, but the hard frost had disappeared. Outside the Keane cottage, the little garden had begun to show patches of green. Tiny cabbage leaves unfolded toward the sun. The onion shoots stood straight despite the wind. The turnips were slower, but they too had broken through the earth. Every evening, Breed insisted on saying good night to them. She knelt beside the tiny plot. "Sleep well." Seamus laughed. "They don't sleep." "They do." "No, they don't. They're resting." Breda watched them from the doorway. "If talking to them helps them grow," she said with a smile, "then keep talking." Breed beamed. "I knew it." The food parcels still came, not as often now. Sometimes nearly 2 weeks would pass. Yet somehow they always arrived before the cupboard became empty. Breda had stopped asking whether another would come. She had begun trusting that it would, not because she understood, because the stranger had never failed them. One afternoon, Father O'Donovan appeared carrying a small bundle wrapped in faded linen. "Of something that belonged to Seamus." Breda looked surprised. "I didn't know anything of his was here." "Neither did I." He smiled gently. "I found it while clearing an old cupboard in the sacristy." She unfolded the cloth carefully. Inside lay a thin notebook. Its leather cover was cracked. The pages were worn and stained from years of use, and Breda smiled through the tears. "I remember this." "You do?" "He was teaching himself to write." Father O'Donovan nodded. "He asked me for old scraps of paper." Breda opened the first pages. There were neat rows of letters, then numbers, then little accounts. 2 hens from Michael Ryan. Returned spade to Liam. 1 sack of oats. Nothing remarkable, simply the ordinary business of an ordinary life. That evening, after the children had fallen asleep, she turned another page. There, written carefully in Seamus's uneven hand, were words she had never seen before. "A man is not measured by what he owns." She stopped, then continued reading, "but by who sleeps easier because he was alive today." Breda pressed her fingers gently against the page. She could almost hear his voice. "That sounds just like you," she whispered. The next morning, Father O'Donovan received an unexpected visitor. Edward removed his cap as he entered the small study. "I hope I'm not disturbing you." "Never." The priest poured him a cup of tea. "What brings you here today?" Edward hesitated. "I've been thinking about Seamus again." The priest smiled knowingly. "I suspected you might." Edward looked around the room. "I feel as though I know him," he admitted, "but only through other people." Father O'Donovan was silent for a moment. Then he crossed to a shelf. "I think there's something you should see." He handed Edward the notebook. It belonged to him. Edward turned the pages slowly. So few words. He wasn't a man of many. Edward smiled at the lists. He even wrote down borrowing a spade. He intended to return everything. Then Edward reached the page with a single sentence. He read it once, then again. His eyes remained fixed upon the words, "A man is not measured." His voice grew quieter. "By who sleeps easier because he was alive today." The room fell silent. Finally Edward looked up. "Did he really write this?" "He did." "I've never heard anything like it." Father O'Donovan smiled. "Neither had I." Edward carried the sentence with him for days. It echoed in his thoughts while he rode across the estate. He saw labourers repairing stone walls, women gathering nettles, children searching fields for anything edible. He wondered how many of them slept easier because someone had shown them kindness that day. The answer, he suspected, was very few. He resolved that where he could, he would change that. That night, Edward did something he had never done before. Instead of preparing only 1 parcel, he prepared 2. The first was for the Keanes. The second contained a loaf of bread, a little meal, and 2 onions. He carried it to the cottage of an elderly widower whose sons had emigrated years before. Edward left the sack quietly against the door. No one saw him. No one thanked him. He found that he didn't mind. As he rode away, he caught himself smiling, not because he had done something noble, because for the first time he understood why Seamus had never spoken of his kindnesses. Some things lost their beauty the moment they were boasted about. The following morning, Breda discovered another parcel. Inside was the usual food, but beneath it lay something unexpected. A tiny wooden whistle, crudely carved, clearly made by hand. Breda picked it up immediately. "For me?" Breda examined it. No note, no mark, nothing to explain it. Seamus smiled. "I think whoever brings the food knows there are children here." Breda blew gently. A soft, sweet note filled the cottage. It was the first music those walls had heard since her father's funeral. Breda closed her eyes. She imagined the unknown benefactors somewhere beyond the fields, perhaps listening to that same breeze, perhaps wondering whether the children smiled. She wished she could tell the stranger that they did. Far away, Edward stood beneath the great oak overlooking the estate. The morning wind carried a faint sound across the fields, a whistle. He smiled, then quietly whispered to the empty air, "I hope you like it, Breed." He'd carved it himself over 3 evenings. It wasn't perfect, neither was he, but thanks to a man who had once dived into a freezing river without a second thought, he was becoming better, one quiet act at a time. Part 8, County Limerick, June 1847. The cottage no longer looked abandoned. Small things had changed. The thatch had been patched where rain once dripped through. The little vegetable plot behind the house had become a patchwork of green. The children had even gathered wild flowers and placed them in an old earthenware jug upon the table. Breda smiled whenever she noticed them. Flowers could not fill empty stomachs, but they reminded people that beauty still existed. Breed had grown fond of her wooden whistle. She carried it everywhere. Sometimes she played cheerful little tunes she invented herself. Sometimes she simply blew one long note and laughed. Seamus pretended it annoyed him. "It sounds like a bird with a sore throat." "It does not. It does. Mam says it's lovely." Breda smiled. "I said I love hearing you happy." Breed grinned. "That's the same thing." The little cottage echoed with laughter. Outside, a passing neighbour stopped. She listened for a moment, then quietly continued on her way with a smile of her own. Laughter had become a rare sound in Ireland. Edward rode slowly across the estate. He no longer looked only toward the Keane cottage. He noticed everything. A chimney with no smoke, a field left untilled, an old woman struggling to carry a bucket from the well. He dismounted without a word. "May I?" The woman looked startled. "You'll dirty your boots, Master Edward." "They're only boots." He carried the bucket to her door and she thanked him awkwardly. As he rode away, she watched him with puzzled eyes. Something about the landlord's son had changed. That evening, Edward returned to Father O'Donovan. The little notebook rested beneath his arm. "I finished it." The priest smiled and... Edward opened it to the familiar page. "I've read this sentence every day." He traced the words gently with one finger. "A man is not measured by what he owns." The priest waited. Edward continued quietly. "I used to think wealth measured a man. And now?" Edward looked out through the window toward the cottage. "Now I think," he smiled, "perhaps it measures only what he has been trusted with." The old priest's eyes brightened. "And what will you do with that trust?" Edward answered without hesitation, "Share it." The priest nodded approvingly. I think Seamus would have liked that answer. Edward looked down at the notebook. "I wish I'd known him." Father O'Donovan smiled. "You do?" Edward looked puzzled. "No, I mean, I never met him properly." The priest shook his head gently. "I believe you've been meeting him for months." The words stayed with Edward all the way home. Meeting him, not through conversation, not through memory, through every story, every kindness, every decision. He began to understand a person did not disappear entirely when they died, not if the goodness they had planted continued growing in someone else. The next delivery was different. Edward packed the usual oats, rice, tea. Then he added something he had debated for days. A warm woolen blanket. It had belonged to him when he was younger. Still in good condition. He folded it carefully. For several moments he simply looked at it. It would be missed. Someone in the house might ask where it had gone. He smiled, then quietly placed it inside the sack. Some things were worth explaining later. Some were worth never explaining at all. That night, clouds covered the moon. The darkness was complete. Edward tied his horse beneath the great oak and carried the heavy parcel along the familiar path. Halfway to the cottage, he stopped. Someone was there. He slipped quietly behind a hedge. Breda stood outside the door, looking up at the stars beyond the clouds. She was praying. Edward remained perfectly still. "I don't ask to know your name any more," she whispered softly into the darkness. "I've stopped asking." She smiled. "I only ask that wherever you are, God watches over you as faithfully as you watched over us." Edward lowered his head. For reasons he couldn't explain, tears filled his eyes. He waited until she had gone inside before placing the sack upon the doorstep. Then he stepped back into the trees. The following morning, the children discovered the blanket. Breed wrapped herself inside it immediately. "It's so soft." Seamus ran his hand across their wool. "It's warmer than ours." Breda unfolded it fully. One corner bore a tiny embroidered letter, E. Nothing more, just a single letter. She frowned, the first mark, the first clue. She ran her fingers thoughtfully over the stitching. E, she whispered. Then she shook her head. Ireland was full of names beginning with E. Edward, Edmund, Elias, Eamon. It proved nothing. Yet for the first time their mysterious benefactor felt just a little less mysterious. That afternoon, Edward sat alone beneath the great oak overlooking the river. The notebook rested open on his knee. His eyes settled once again upon Seamus's simple sentence. He smiled. Then taking up his pencil, he wrote beneath it in careful handwriting, "If I help another sleep easier tonight," he paused, looking across the fields where the Keane cottage stood, half hidden among the hedgerows. Then he finished the thought, "Then a part of Seamus Keane still walks this earth." Edward read the words once. He didn't cross them out. He didn't change them. For the first time since the day he had been pulled from the freezing river, he felt that the brave man who had saved his life had never truly left him. He simply lived now, in every kind thing Edward chose to do.